Hey, welcome back to Fine Takes. So today we're going to be discussing season 2 of The White Lotus after covering season 1 last time. And whereas season 1 was very much focused on envy, driven by class, season 2 is much more focused on sex, on the dynamics of power related to sex, and of the ability that money or power has over sex, but also the power that sex has over money. So let's jump in by talking about a returning character. Well, two of them. We have Tanya and Portia. And Tanya comes back and she's much more humanized this time. Last time she was a clown, a rich, pathetic clown. And this time we see her differently. We see her as more of a sad, pathetic, we see her internality, her yearning for love, her feelings that she'll never get what she wants or have what she wants. She's much more humanized in this. So jumping in, Tanya and Portia are both victims to what we could call sexual extortion. So Tanya is seduced by Greg from season 1, right? And we learn that Greg is involved in some sort of conspiracy with Quentin. In parallel, Portia, who Tanya says reminds her of a younger version of herself, gets involved with Jack, who is supposedly, as we learn later not to be the case, Quentin's nephew. So before we jump into this, let's just talk about Quentin, because Quentin is almost a different take of Armand, right? Whereas Armand was ostensibly working class or poor, Quentin is off the bat presented as very rich, very glamorous. Whereas Armand was victim to his own desires for drugs, his own lust for Dylan, we see Quentin as the master of other people's lust. And we'll get into that in a bit. But whereas Armand was subject to everyone else's whims and desires, in this we, at least at the start, see Quentin holding all the cards. So Quentin's plot here is to somehow take Tanya's money. And it's unclear if he aims to do this by extorting her after filming her having an affair with a man named Niccolo, or if he aims to kill her, have Greg inherit the money, and then somehow Greg passes it along to him. In any case, we understand that Tanya is subject to Quentin's manipulation in this to gain her money. On the other hand, we have Jack and Portia. Jack is employed by Quentin, and as an employee of Quentin, you can see him as almost an agent of Quentin. And this is a Quentin style of manipulation. Quentin's style is to use something beautiful, someone beautiful, to control somebody else by their own lust. And what we see with Portia is just that. Jack is very handsome, and he is brought in specifically for keeping her distracted with her own sexuality. So we see something similar happening with the DeGrasso men. And just for a quick refresher, the DeGrasso men are Albie, that's the youngest. There's Michael Imperioli's character, whose name is Dominic. And then there's the grandfather, played by F. Murray Abraham. That is Bert. So we have these three men. And we see the way that the prostitutes are able to take advantage of Albie in this way. So jumping back over to Portia, let's look at her as an archetype of Gen Z. And we looked at a different archetype of Gen Z in the last video with Olivia, but in this video, we're looking at another take on a Gen Z girl. So Portia can be described as disillusioned, economically desperate, very much adrift, a wanderer. She tries to wax poetic at one point about the meaninglessness of taking an Instagram picture that others have already taken, but it kind of came up flat and it just seemed sad or adolescent. She's articulate, but she doesn't really have anything to say. And to take it a step further, there's a scene where she mentions doom scrolling in her room, which lets us know that this isn't a reader. This isn't a person with a strong set of their own interests. What she does have is her own sexual freedom. We see her trying to get involved in some kind of sex for entertainment. Nothing wrong with that. But it's very interesting because unlike many of the characters, her sexuality does not come across in a glamorous or alluring way. She is not sexy. And it's not that the actress is unattractive, but her clothes are very loose fitting in this. Her makeup is very dowdy in this. She's kind of homely, and there's no attempt to sexualize her. So we see her as sexually liberated and at the same time completely void of sexual glamour. She has a detachment from the wokeness of modern masculinity, and this comes out when she meets Albie, whom she describes as relatively normal for a liberal arts student. So moving over to Albie, he is a take on the Madonna whore complex, but it's a very Gen Z take on it. What I mean by that is Albie's take goes so far as to completely eliminate the category of whore. Before we dig into that, let's talk a little bit about Freud's Madonna whore complex. So his idea was basically some men could not maintain the idea of a woman as both sexual and good, right? A woman who had sexuality was a whore, and a woman who was good could not have sexuality. And the reasons for this are explored by Freud in terms of the castration complex and ideas around the mother and the Oedipus complex. For the sake of this, we can just call it the Madonna whore complex and take a look at Albie's variation of it. So Albie cannot see women negatively. At one point, his grandfather says, "Women aren't all saints, Albie. They're just like us." And so from Albie's grandfather, Bert, this man who Albie sees as very outdated in his approach to gender, this is a pretty progressive statement. It's saying women are human beings. They're not that different from us. But to Albie, this feels very hostile in some way, or feels very dismissive. This makes Albie prey to literally a whore. And this is Lucia. Lucia meets Albie and understands very, very quickly that this is somebody who she can play. She cons him by saying she's in danger, she needs $50,000, and Albie buys right into it, while his father does not, right? His father is saying, hey, this is obviously a scam, don't do it. On the other hand, Albie says, I will put in a good word for you with my mother, who is his ex-wife, or they're going through some sort of marital dispute, and this means something to the father. Albie essentially extorts his father for this money to give to Lucia the whore, and with that, she goes and takes her money. What's interesting about this is that this is not a sophisticated take on women. This is a very neurotic take on women. This is a dehumanizing take on women. And while Bert, Albie's father, is obviously, in some ways, outdated in what he thinks is appropriate to say or do with a woman, it is a much more humanized approach to dealing with women that he has as opposed to Albie. And in the final scene where we see all three of the DeGrasso men together, Albie's moment of growth is where the older two DeGrasso men watch a woman from the back as she walks away, and we see Albie do the same. This is him recognizing that women are sexual, they have their own desires, they're human, they're not these perfect Madonnas that he envisioned them to be. It's also interesting because within the tradition of Italian art, there's a theme of the three ages of men. This theme plays out here where we have Albie, the young, we have Dominic in the middle, in his middle age, and we have Bert, the grandfather, who is the oldest of these, right? And so each one of them is defined by their attitude towards women. Where Albie has this naive attitude, Dominic has a more, we could call it, stuck attitude. He can't seem to make sense of his relationship with his wife. He's sorry for cheating on her, and at the same time, he's engaging with prostitutes while he's away from her. So he's having a difficult time with it. And then there's Bert, the father, who seems to have everything under control. His attitude seems to be the most developed. This theme within Italian art history is played out here to some extent. On the other hand, Quentin is kind of the absolute counterpart to Albie. Whereas Albie is very vulnerable to these sorts of manipulations, Quinter is a master of manipulating others with lust. He controls Jack and Niccolo to fulfill his desire for money here. The scene where Tanya walks in on Quentin and Jack having sex is more than just a great scene because of the significance to the plot. Visually, the golden backdrop brings forward the Italo-Byzantine style, where the gold represented the male divine, God the Father, masculine power. And what we're able to see here is Quentin's absolute sexual power. Quentin is able to have Jack as a sexual object for his own gratification, his own sexual gratification. But on top of that, he has Jack as a sexual agent working with others on controlling their lust, not just his own. So going beyond this, the whole anal sex part of this is significant. The idea of anality relates to feces, control, retention, and power. And it also relates back to gold. Gold is very much related in psychoanalysis to feces. If you'd like me to talk more about that in another video, absolutely can. But essentially, gold and feces are somewhat interchangeable in psychoanalysis, and it's almost that feces are the profane form of the thing, and gold is the sacred form. And going back to the idea of gold and masculinity, within the tradition of Catholic art and specifically Italian art history, there are many images of Christ being born from what looks like the sky, but also from what looks like an anus in the sky. This is generally white or some form of pink and white. You can find many examples of this, but basically this is God the Father taking the woman out of the birthing process. It's the elimination of the feminine in place of the absolute power of God the Father, the masculine. Going back to psychology here and going into the idea of anal sex, hopefully I don't get kicked off YouTube, but just diving into the psychoanalysis of it a little bit, what we see is that there's two functions that occur within anal intercourse. You have the anus as the sexual organ, but then also as the excretory organ. And it has these two functions. When the excretory overlaps with the sexual, it is seen as an interruption. And so, given the relationship that gold and feces have of profane and sacred, you could argue that the anus as a sexual organ is in some way a golden womb, a golden receptacle for the phallus, or whatever you want to call it. There's a relationship to gold and power that occurs here. Within Camille Paglia's work, in Sexual Personae, she talks about how gay men, the quote is, "Gay men, through their non-procreative sex, attempt to diminish the chaotic power of femininity entirely." This goes back to what I was describing about the Italo-Byzantine art, where the role of Mary is completely eliminated, well, not completely, but visually eliminated by saying that Christ was birthed directly from God's anus, from the sky. Within this, what you get is this idea of an omnipotent fantasy from Quentin. Quentin's omnipotence is represented in its relation to Freud's idea of anality. Quentin's anus as a almost divine entity, his sense of control is the force that moves the plot forward. So what we see here is an interesting idea of omnipotence play out. Within this golden setting, which represents in some ways Quentin's male womb, his ultimate power is played out by making this heterosexual, attractive male perform intercourse with him. Going beyond that, the categories of sexual orientation or heterosexual versus homosexual are erased. While Jack is clearly a prostitute employed by Quentin to achieve an end and also for his own entertainment, Greg is more ambiguously employed, and maybe they did have some sort of sexual relationship, but it's clear that there is a sexual attraction between Greg and Tanya. Niccolo, on the other hand, we don't really know if he did or didn't have a relationship with Quentin, if there ever was sex between those two, but it doesn't really matter because Niccolo, his sexuality was owned in a different way by Quentin and used in a different way by Quentin, and so he is mastering Niccolo's sexuality. In other words, to sum it all up, Quentin has almost a godlike power here to control others for his own lust, but also to control others by their own lust. Fittingly, given the divine patriarchal implication of gold and homosexuality erasing the feminine, he's undone by Tanya, who is a chaotic female force. In her final scene, we see her kill everybody who potentially aimed to do her wrong, but then we see her die in her own own very Tanya-esque way. After successfully thwarting this plot, she attempts to go from the yacht to a smaller boat, tripping and hitting her head, and eventually giving way to the larger chaotic force of the sea. And if you want to understand the significance of the sea, I do an analysis of it in my prior video where we talk about White Lotus season 1. So Tanya, her plot line ends in tragedy, whereas with the DeGrassos, we see Albie grow. The amount of money, it wasn't tragic, it was not significant to them. So there's a lot more that we can go over here. If you want me to go over Ethan and Daphne and Cameron and that whole plot line, happy to do that in another video. Also, it fits right in with this theme of lust and control, where we have another homosexual hotel manager. We have Valentina, who is in her own way controlled by these same prostitutes. So happy to cover that in another video too. Just let me know in the comments. I'm going to conclude here with what was already discussed today. So maybe you can tell, I think this season of White Lotus was much, much stronger than the first one. This one really felt like a murder mystery to me, whereas I dinged the last season for maybe not being as visually interesting as it could have been and not having as dynamic a set. The set played a really important part here. There were many, many scenes outside of the hotel and inside of the hotel where the scenery really came alive and drove the plot. What we saw with this Quentin character was a very, very different take on a dangerous homosexuality. Compared to Armand, who was victim to his desires, Quentin was a master of his desires and other people's. And whereas Tanya died, in this case, as somewhere in between a hero and a clown, well, I guess that is somewhat similar to the last one, where Armand was both our hero and a clown. So the set, the use of these art historical themes, the use of envy and desire, the complex power dynamics here, the idea, this constant push and pull between money and sexuality. I give this a 9.5 out of 10. I think this is one of the best series made in the 21st century so far. So that's my review of season 2 of The White Lotus. What I would love for you to do is subscribe, like, and comment. If you want to see more reviews like this, if you appreciated the analysis, let me know. And if there are any elements here that you thought I should have covered, that I missed out on, if you think there were details I should have spoken more about, if you think I just completely ignored certain things, you're probably right. I didn't talk about everything. Happy to make another video and go into depth on anything you guys want to hear about. So thanks for watching and stay critical.